Scott Pilgrim is a series about relationships more than anything else, I think. Because of that focus, the characters are almost never alone. They are always with their friends, going to clubs, going to parties. They're always at their apartments at home with their roommates, and we very seldom actually see the characters just by themselves. And I think there are obvious reasons for that. This is a comedy series after all, and so it's hard to have a lot of comedy if there is only one person on the page. If you want any kind of conflict, or if you want the drama that a romance series like this needs, then you have to have multiple people on screen at almost any given moment. And after all, this is a series that's about a guy defeating his girlfriend's 7 evil exes in order to be with her, and so it's not exactly the most serious thing in the world. For the most part, I don't think that the books are really all that deep, but I do think that as the series progressed and as a period of years passed from the start of the series to the ending of the series, I can't help but feel that the books became more mature. I can't help but feel that the books became more reflective and more thoughtful. Because yeah, Scott Pilgrim is funny, it's silly, it's just a lot of fun. But I find that there is, towards the end of the series, a large emphasis on loneliness and who you are as a person outside of relationships. Now, even though I think that the idea of loneliness becomes more clear and more apparent as the series goes on, especially in the last couple books, it's something that shows up at the very beginning of the first book. When Scott is having a dream, he's in a desert and he says that he's alone, and he says he's so alone. And then that's when he first sees Ramona traveling through the subspace highway in his dreams. Now, Scott is not really a super reflective character. Like I said, all the characters in this book are usually seen with friends, but when he is alone, when he is shown to have some time to himself, he's usually either playing games or sleeping, and that's it. Scott is consistently depicted as a kind of loser, as a kind of slacker, and he doesn't seem to have any kind of great ambition in his life. But this dream seems like a way of admitting that he is lonely, that he does feel alone in his life. And I do think that those are two different things. I think that what it means to be alone and what it means to be lonely are very different from each other, and I feel like that's something that we've addressed a lot more in recent years. So I will talk on that more later. But really, Scott is alone. Now, Scott saying that he's alone here seems to echo a page that we see later on of him after his breakup with Envy, one of his exes. In this page, he's just out on the street, and again, he's just saying that he's alone. And it seems like this loneliness is what drives him to start dating a high schooler, Knives Chow, and it's pretty clear from the start that Scott likes her, but he's not dating her because he loves her. He's dating her because it's easy. He's dating her because it's simple, it's uncomplicated, and because it fills a void within him. It fills that kind of loneliness, at least for a little bit. But as we see in the dream, even though he's dating Knives at this point, he's still alone. He still feels lonely. And so from that point on, he starts dating Ramona Flowers, and everything is just peaches and gravy, or however the saying goes. Like I said, he does have to defeat her 7 evil exes, and so for the first half of the series, he gets through the first 3, but there really isn't too much drama or anything like that. It seems like Scott and Ramona like each other, and they're in the honeymoon phase still. But by the time that we hit book 4, Scott and Ramona have been dating for several months at this point. And as I previously mentioned, Scott is a slacker. He has no ambitions in life. And so that is when that really starts to become a problem. And everyone's like, Scott, what are you doing? You know, you should get a job. You should fill your time in some way. By the time we hit book 5, Scott and Ramona are living together. And as previously stated, they've been together for quite some time at this point. And it really kind of feels like the evil exes situation is wearing on both of them. While Scott's loneliness has been satiated by the presence of Ramona and from dating her, Ramona starts to feel lonely in this relationship, as evidenced by her gazing out the window, or her not paying attention to conversations with Scott, or her just seeming distant. And this goes back to the idea of what it means to be alone versus what it means to be lonely. Because I would argue that at this point in the series, Scott and Ramona are not alone. They are together, obviously, but Ramona appears lonely. And again, Scott gets some alone time, but whenever he has it, he plays games. And so there's an entire day he spends, for instance, where Ramona's off at work and he just plays games on her cell phone. And so Ramona spends pretty much all of volume 5 of the series being distant. And for that reason, this is one of my favorite volumes in the series, just because of the fact that it doesn't feel like a happy fairy tale at this point. Yeah, it is silly, it is wacky and goofy and zany, but at this point there's really a kind of seriousness to Scott and Ramona's relationship, and it's clear that Ramona is not happy. Meanwhile, it just kind of feels like Scott is oblivious. It feels like Scott is so happy that his emotional needs are being met and he does not feel lonely, that he is blind to the fact that Ramona does feel lonely. And so at the end of the volume, after Ramona finds out that Scott was dating Knives at the same time he was first dating her, Ramona leaves. Throughout this series, she's seen with a kind of halo around her. It's called the glow, and the glow gets so bright and causes her to disappear. From that point on, Scott is alone. So let's talk about the glow for a second. The glow is not found in the movie. In fact, the closest thing to the glow in the movie is when Ramona shows that she has a processor stuck in the back of her head that Gideon put there, and it fills the same function really. In the books, it's revealed that the glow is an emotional weapon made by Gideon. The glow is explained as something that, quote, seals you inside your head. Just you and your issues. And the glow appears anytime there's a kind of stressful situation that Ramona finds herself in, or a kind of emotionally difficult situation. You see Ramona with the glow in several different situations, such as whenever she finds out that Scott slept over at Kim's house. Even though the two of them didn't do anything, Ramona still feels scared by it. And then after that, whenever Ramona just sees Kim, she starts glowing again. When Gideon is mentioned in the very first volume, Ramona starts to glow. And then one of my favorite instances of the glow is whenever Ramona finds out that Scott slept over at his friend Lisa's house. And again, like with Kim, Scott and Lisa didn't do anything. Scott slept on the couch and Lisa slept in her own bed. But there's still that threat. There's still that anxiety and that fear that Ramona feels. And the table kind of turns at this point, because while Ramona is glowing in this instance, Scott finds out that Ramona's ex, Roxy, slept over at Ramona's house. And so at this point, Scott himself begins to glow. And we actually get to see what the glow is like from Scott's perspective. And it looks kind of crazy. The colors are all warped and it feels really psychedelic and kind of just strange. And really, I think that more than anything else, I think the glow is just a metaphor for overthinking. Like Gideon said, the glow just seals you inside your head, and that's all overthinking does. In these books, anytime a character's head starts to glow, it's whenever they're worried about their relationship. It's when they're worried about not being able to trust the other person. It's when they're worried or scared of being cheated on. It's when they're worried or scared of losing that love. They're scared of having to become alone once again. And that's what the glow is designed to do, is it's designed to trap you in your head with just you and your issues. And so because of that, whenever the characters do experience the glow, they already are alone. Even though they might be around people, even though they might be surrounded by many people, they are alone in their own heads. So, like I said, at the end of book 5, Ramona leaves Scott. At this point in time, Scott only has one more evil ex to defeat, but he's lost the girl. Because he's lost Ramona, there's no reason for him to really defeat Gideon. And Scott doesn't just win Ramona back after a day. No, Scott and Ramona are separated for a period of months. And throughout all this, Scott feels lonely, as one might expect, but he doesn't do anything except what he's already done before, namely play games and sleep. And once again, that loneliness starts to manifest in his dreams. He has a repeat of the very first dream in the series where he's alone in the desert. Scott has another dream where he is impaled by Ramona with a sword and then he starts being devoured by his exes. And so Scott doesn't want to face that loneliness. He wants to distract himself through video games and through playing his PSP all day. Whenever he's invited out, Scott declines. He would rather just be alone playing his games. And so even though Scott isn't glowing at this point, I think that he's still trapped in his head, the same as if he had the glow. Scott doesn't know how to be alone in a way that is healthy and constructive. And so he tries to mediate that loneliness in unhealthy ways. Obviously, like I said, through playing games, through sleeping, but also at the encouragement of Wallace, Scott tries to go and sleep with all of his exes. He hits up Knives, who's now 18, and tries to sleep with her, and she declines. He finds Envy again and tries to sleep with her, and she declines. And he tries to get back with Kim, but she declines. Now, in an actual positive move, Scott was invited by Kim to go out and have a wilderness sabbatical with her and to just go and spend some time in the forest and to spend some time alone away from civilization. And so he goes up there with Kim, who is now living at home with her family. And that's when he tries to get back with her, blah, blah, blah. But the wilderness sabbatical is a really good move, I think, because it shows that he's taking steps forward. He's finally putting down the games and stopping sleeping, and he's actually trying to do something. And it is in the Canadian forest that he sees Nega Scott. And Scott hunts down Nega Scott and tries to defeat Nega Scott. He tries to beat up Nega Scott. And Nega Scott is representative of all those bad traits that Scott has that he doesn't want to recognize. And it's representative of everything bad about Scott that Scott wants to push away or push down. Finally, Scott accepts Nega Scott. He then recognizes everything bad he's done. He recognizes that, yeah, he has not been the best boyfriend in the past. He has made mistakes. He screwed up by not breaking up with Knives before he started dating Ramona. And so he is able to overcome his loneliness to a certain extent, at least, by accepting those parts of himself. Multiple characters tell Ramona when she's still around that she can't keep running from herself. And that really, to me, seems to be the core struggle of loneliness within these books. Characters fundamentally don't like themselves. Characters fundamentally don't think that they are good people. And so why would they want to be alone with that? I find it really interesting that Kim is the most cynical, bitter, pessimistic person in the series, but she's the most okay with being alone. She is the character who willingly goes on a wilderness sabbatical and invites Scott to come along with her, but she's the one who takes the first step. And I can't help but feel that her bitterness and her pessimism plays into that somehow. And really what I think it is I think that Kim is willing to admit when things suck. I think that she's willing to recognize it and to recognize when there's a problem, whereas Scott maybe isn't. And so because of that, he struggles with the problems more because he won't recognize they're there. And so because of that, he is not as okay with being himself. Scott seems to want to push things down and to repress them, whereas Kim just accepts them as they are. Scott has memory issues, as do a couple other characters, but Kimberly remembers everything. Now, after Scott comes back from the wilderness sabbatical in the final book, he goes to the Chaos Theater to defeat Gideon, the final evil X. And Scott dies, and then he comes back, and Ramona comes back with him because it says death is a subspace highway or something. It's not really explained. And Scott gets demotivated, as he has a habit of doing. He doesn't really want to fight Gideon, but Ramona encourages him to finish what he started, aka finish defeating the evil X's. And Scott's like, I didn't start this. Scott finally seems to have some self-respect. And for really the first time that I can think of in the series, he seriously questions the entire premise that the series is based off of. He questions, why do I have to fight these evil X's to be with this girl? Now, Scott is experiencing the glow at this point, so he is kind of trapped in his own head, but I don't think that he's making a bad point here. I mean, the idea of having to fight someone's exes in order to date them is just like so toxic. And again, this is a silly little series, so I think you just kind of have to go along with it. But I think it's an important step that Scott questions why he is doing this in the first place. But regardless, Scott and Ramona defeat Gideon, and then it's kind of just a happy ending story. They recognize that neither person is perfect, but they accept that about each other. And so because of that, they can move forward. And so I think that the loneliness that Scott experienced played a really big role in him being able to accept his flaws and in him being able to reflect on his actions and on who he really is, which led him to be able to admit that he has made mistakes and Ramona has made mistakes. That period of loneliness allowed him to come back into their relationship better than ever. After they defeat Gideon, Ramona reveals where she has been this entire period of several months when Scott has been alone. No one's heard from Ramona. So what has Ramona been doing? What great things has she been up to? And it turns out that she also went on a wilderness sabbatical because that's just what every character is doing, I guess. But she ended up just watching X-Files. And so everyone's like, you and Scott are made for each other. And so I can't help but feel that Ramona's loneliness and her chance to be alone and by herself allowed her the same kind of reflective opportunities that it allowed Scott. It allowed both of these characters to recognize the mistakes that they were making and the flaws and cracks that were in their relationship and to come together and to hopefully rebuild and repair them. While loneliness is shown to bring people together because of the fact that Scott chases these girls because he is lonely, I think that loneliness is also shown to play a very important role in being able to keep a relationship together. Or rather, maybe it is the chance that Scott gets to learn to be alone without being lonely that causes him to have a better chance of having a good relationship in the future. I think this idea, the idea that you can be alone without feeling lonely and that is something to be strived for, actually comes through most clearly in the character of Knives Chow. Knives, as first depicted, is a girl who's obsessed with Scott Pilgrim, and she fights for his love, and she is kind of his own evil ex. Ramona actually has to fight her, and so even though Scott doesn't have his own organized league of evil exes, they're still there, and it's still baggage that Ramona has to deal with. So Knives is repeatedly shown to be obsessed with Scott for the next several books, and she keeps on hanging out with their friend group. But finally, whenever you actually see her in the final book, she's moved on, and she doesn't want to be with Scott anymore. She's learned how to be okay with herself. She's learned how to be okay being alone. I think that her character trajectory is actually very similar to Scott's, because Scott had a really horrible emotional breakup with Envy, and then he gets with someone else, and then he learns how to be alone after that relationship crumbles. And with Knives, she had a really traumatic breakup with Scott, and then she gets with someone else, young Neil, and then things don't work out between them, and then she learns how to be alone and learns how to be happy being alone. Knives really is, by the end of the series, alone but not lonely. And so even though I think that the ending does kind of wrap things up very quickly, I still think that the loneliness that the characters feel plays a very important role. I think that it forces Scott to be okay with himself and to confront his problems as opposed to running away from them. And so really I do think that this series, which is primarily about relationships, can actually teach us a lot about what it means to be alone. These aspects of the Scott Pilgrim comic for me really highlight how important it is to be able to be alone without necessarily feeling lonely. I think it's important to deal with your personal problems so that way hopefully you don't have too much baggage when you're going into any kind of relationship. So feel free to leave your thoughts down below, check out my other videos if you want, and always have a nice night. So thank you for watching and see ya.